Hi, I'm back, and I thought it would be fun to return to the world of Eastward. So before we do that and get into another breakdown, I wanted to just say thanks for everyone that has watched and commented. I have read everything, and it is all super heartwarming and encouraging and so positive. I'm really having a good time doing these, and I hope that you're enjoying them, and I'm happy to break down anything people want to hear. And one of the tracks that actually really surprised me, because it wasn't one of the kind of main tracks that was featured, is this piece from this happens to be in the Quake Valley secret dungeon. I just pulled it up of YouTube as an area in the game that uses the piece, but the name of the track is Underground, and it is kind of a mysterious, isolated, lonely sounding piece, very reminiscent of the kinds of dungeon tracks in the 16-bit era of RPGs and games. And this is the track I'm going to be breaking down today. So it was part of the original hour or so of material that I wrote for Eastward. For those of you that don't know, I did an hour at the original scope. This was part of it. We just did a bunch of dungeon tracks. I'm going to pause it because it's going to go to an ad in a second. And then I wrote an hour later, but this was in the original scope. I think we did maybe 3 or 4 dungeon tracks. This was one of them, and it was designed to play in areas just like what you're seeing. So let's jump over to Logic, and I will share the project with you. So here we are. This is the final version of Underground. As you can see, the name of the project is Dungeon Underground. It's version 1C, which means that it was the 3rd iteration of this piece. Now, before we get too used to focusing on the final version, I actually want to jump over and show you the original version. So this is the original version. This is version 1, which means it was the first thing I wrote. Typically, I will use letters for revisions. So version 1C, which was the final version, was the 3rd iteration of version 1. Now, if the developer hadn't liked it, I would have gone to version 2. If we needed a revision, that would have been 2A, 2B, 2C, and so on. But this is version 1, and the main difference, the most notable difference, and it is a pretty big difference, is the tempo here is 127 as opposed to 105. I don't know if you caught that. We'll jump to it in a minute, but take a listen. So similar tonality, similar palette. In fact, I think the palette is probably 90% similar, but this is much, much, much faster. And this all sounded fine in isolation. This is a good example of a lot of times a piece will sound fine, you'll get it in the game, and then you'll realize that it isn't working. And after we got this in the game, it just sounded way too energetic and way too frenetic for the kind of feel we were trying to establish in those underground dungeons, which again is that sort of mysterious, lonely, isolated feel. This was way too fast to communicate that. So ultimately, I thinned out the arrangement and slowed it down quite a bit. So let's jump back to the final version and we'll break it down. All right, we're back at our final version, version 1C. As you can tell, the tempo is at 105. And as we play it, the intention, now you can really hear the difference. You really get to sit between chords. The harmonic rhythm is much slower. You can really immerse yourself between each chord change. And you can also really sort of feel that rhythm that's in between each one. So let's look at the density here too. I think this is 13 tracks. Let's count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. It's 14 tracks, plus some delay and reverb, which is typically how I like to lay things out. That's pretty typical of the level of density for an Eastward piece. Some have more, some have a lot more, some have quite a bit less, especially the ambient pieces. So let's just start from the top and break these down. So the first instrument I'm calling Bukla Daiko, which is a percussive part. Let's solo it up and listen to it. It is an instrument on one of my favorite synths, alto. So alto, I've kind of described it before and probably been, kind of spoken my enthusiasm for it, but it's one of my favorite plugins. it is essentially a plugin version of a Buchla music easel, but all the patching happens in this sort of center section. So this looks like a fairly complicated patch. In some ways it is, but it's really it's a percussive sounding patch with some, it's got a sequencer that triggers itself, and then it has some random kind of interstitial like little triggers and repeats that happen. So it's got this sort of percussive rhythmic energy. Let's just listen to it for a second. And the main accents are here, like dun 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 dun. So fairly standard rhythm, but it kind of keeps the pulse of this piece. Oops, I think I muted it. So the next is one of my favorite techniques, which is filter pinging. This is on Basil, which is another synth from Yuhi. Very similar in some ways to Ace, just a lot more modules. It's a patch that I called Electric Stick Orchestra. Let's listen to that while I sort of describe what's going on. And I'll turn some of these up so you can hear them. Again, it's a pinged filter, so we're using the filter as a sound source. I can turn the resonance up and we'll get a much longer decay, which is of course not what we want. But if we trace some of these, we've got a envelope 2. The audio out from envelope 2 is going into the filter, which means that we're just using a click from an envelope with just a tiny decay. Remember, this envelope is not controlling the filter modulation, which is how you typically use an envelope. It's actually using the audio to excite the filter right around self-oscillation. And then it's just doing various things with that sound. So I'm FMing it. I'm using the sequencer here to re-trigger it. In a lot of ways, it's very similar to this Buchla Daiko part. It's just a higher end component. If we solo these two up by themselves, oh, I muted this, sorry. Oh, you know what? It's muting itself because I think it's got some automation. Let's go back to the beginning. They very much work together. This third part is an actual taiko part. This is from Storm Drum, and it sounds like this. And if we solo all these up together, so that sampled taiko part is sort of an acoustic component to the electronic percussion that we have. As we move later in the piece, we get this section that it's kind of a bridge section, and it's got these low hits. Oh, I know why that happened, and I'm going to fix it. 1 second. Okay, I'm back with the correct sample rate, which is the problem. So if we listen to this, there's another percussion part here called low hits, which to me, in some ways, they don't sound all that low, but they are there to kind of provide some low end energy and a percussive, they're kind of more hits, which is of course what they're called. What I like to do a lot, now this is another sound from Storm Drum 2. What I really like to do to just emphasize the low end of something is just to cut out the high end. A lot of times you can cut out the high end, not even emphasize the low end, and just by nature of the fact that you've cut out the high end, so in this case it's everything above 1,000 hertz, which is a pretty low cut, it actually brings the low end out more. And so sometimes the best kind of EQ boost is actually a cut where you don't want to hear the frequencies. So let's solo this up, and let's actually take all this off. So very different. This just sounds like big percussive hits, which is not what I wanted. I wanted some subtlety. So let's turn our EQs on. This EQ is actually not boosting anything. It's just cutting even more around 60. And then I have some fairly subtle wave folding on. Wave folding is one of my favorite distortion effects. I'll save what it's actually doing for another video, but it just gives it this kind of distorted quality, but distorted in a very controlled way. Like we're not clipping, we're not blowing anything up. It's just kind of this round, nice kind of distortion. Next, we have this random plucks part. Another sound on Ace, one of my favorite synths that I've called pseudo wave folder. Every sound down to the percussion was created for this cue. And I do a lot of that. So a lot of times I'll just start from the default sound and work something up that I feel like fits the piece. So I called this pseudo wave folder. We just got done talking about wave folding. It's more FM, I think, but it's this sort of unstable, wobbly sound. Let's open up the filter. And it seems like we're using the filter here as a sound source. We've got it way up in self-oscillation mode. We've got a subharmonic, an LFO tuned to a subharmonic frequency, modulating it. So this is a really interesting plucked sound that just gives it kind of an acoustic character. I think what I was going for here is the way that 16-bit sounds can kind of sound like fake versions of what they're emulating. The next 3 tracks we have are piano. So let's solo these up and listen to these. In order to actually mute the bugla, we have to mute the track because remember that instrument triggers itself. So let's actually skip to this one. These are all the same. Actually, this one is a sampled upright piano, but these two are Piano Tech, one of my favorite piano synths. It's a synth, actually. It's not a sample-based piano. So it looks like this, although I think I actually used Piano Tech 4 on the actual score. If we solo this up and listen to it, the piano has this really kind of dull, muted, warbly character. And a big part of the reason for that is that I'm using a delay plugin. In this case, it's Timeless 2. Now, Timeless 3 has since come out, and I would use that if I was starting this cue from scratch, but I already had Timeless 2, I keep it on here just for this purpose if I need to open an old session. Let's listen to it without this. In fact, it might be better to listen to this one, which I'm doing a very similar thing on. Yeah, this is better because it's higher and you can hear it better. Listen to it without this. There, it sounds much fuller, like a regular acoustic piano. I'm just adjusting the volume so you can actually hear me. If we turn it on, I am actually using a delay plugin. I'm going to even turn the delay and reverb off completely. I'm basically using a delay plugin with no delay. As you can see, there's only 5 milliseconds of delay, which is the least it can have. And I'm modulating that by 0.055% with an LFO. And the reason I'm doing that is just to give it a little bit of warble. So I'm using a delay plugin basically as a tape emulator. To me, it actually serves a better purpose as a tape emulator than an actual tape emulator. So if we listen to it, let's turn it off and let's bring in an actual tape emulator. In this case, let's bring in Mello-Fi from Arturia, which is great for what it does. And what it does in this case is it doesn't really mess the fidelity up to the degree that I wanted it to. It gives us some pitch warble, which is nice. And we can change the wear and everything, but it's a very different effect than what this achieves, which is this kind of dark, veiled, kind of gauzy, muted sound. So one of my favorite things is misusing plugins. So moving down the list, we've got this instrument called FM Pad, which is another Yuhi favorite. This is a sound that I made called FM Trumpet. That's what it sounds like, kind of up high, but this is made for, it's used for kind of chordal stabs here. Next instrument, this is actually muted because I was using it to control a hardware synth. Now it says Juno, but it's not actually the Juno 60 or the 6 or even the 106. It's actually an Alpha Juno. So I had an Alpha Juno that I used on this, and then I traded it for the rack mount version, which is called the MKS 50, and it's functionally exactly the same as one of the Alpha Junos. It just fits into a rack. And I will actually show it to you here. So switching to iPhone camera, it is down here, and you can see it in my rack. It's the black unit just above that audio interface. It's an MKS50. Great sounding synth, super underrated. And I'm generally not going to talk about gear on this channel, but I do feel like that is one of the vintage synths that you can still get for a good deal. It has a ton of character. It has a really great sounding filter that does not self-oscillate, that has a lot of, it just, you can really, I don't know, it's like really silky and unique. So let me actually play, let me solo this up first. To mute this. So this was a sound that was derived from a sound called Prairie on the Tumbleseed soundtrack. And I'm actually going to bring that sound up on the MKS50, the hardware synth that I just finished showing you. I'm going to, oops. So I actually have it up already. And I use a patch management app called Patchbase to pick the sounds. And this is actually already it because it's up. So if we listen to it, you can really hear how musical that filter is. There's a lot of resonance. I can even turn it up a little bit. Tons of character, and that's not even with any reverb on it. So let's go back to the original sound and let's put some reverb on it. Similar amount of reverb to the bounced version that we're seeing here in blue. So that's our sound. Now I did do a version of this sound in Diva that I'm calling Wistful Drops. Coming up with names for sounds is fun. Sometimes they're good, and you know, they're always memorable. So very similar, right? Let's turn this up a little bit. I'm gonna screw up my mix here, but whatever. So let's listen to that. Let's listen to it just to, let me just play a triad. How about that? Just something simple. So C major triad on Diva. And then this on the actual hardware. Oh, and before we do that, this is basically an Alpha Juno. You've got the same oscillator section, the same filter section, not quite the same envelope section, which I think is really the defining difference. It's actually not in this, it's in the envelopes. But these are all the weird wave shapes that the Alpha Juno was capable of. Let's go over to the Alpha Juno, or again, in my case, MKS50. Remember, they're exactly the same. This is showing you the actual patch, and you can see this envelope shape because you have these multi-stage envelopes that are not confined to ADSR envelopes. You get this really kind of delicate, very tactile sounding attack. Now the difference is subtle. The tone is pretty much spot on. But let's go back to Diva. And you know, we're splitting hairs here, right? Splitting hairs is, like I like to say, part of my job. But you get this different kind of more tactile attack on MKS50. That has not stopped me from using these interchangeably. Sometimes one of them works better than the other one. Neither one of them is objectively better, but you know, it's all subjective like anything else. So let's keep moving down the list. This is a sound, another sound from Basile that's I called Summer Sign. Which is kind of it's hard to see the arrangement with this big plugin open, so let's close it. But this sounds like this. And some of these are old versions of plugins that I don't have installed anymore, but none of them are super crucial, just for our purposes today. This has my tape effect on it. So let's turn that off. And we can really hear the high end now. I'm using a compressor on here, not for compression necessarily, but really more for distortion. So this SSL style compressor, for whatever reason, I don't use these compressors in Logic a lot. I don't know why, because they're good. Let's turn it off. It does compress the tail of the sound, but what I really like it for is it distorts the attack just a little bit, and combined with that tape warble, we get a really vintage sound. last but not least is our Buchla marimba, which is a sound called Buchla sine plink. That is another very complicated looking patch that I made. And this is meant to sound kind of like a synth marimba. And then if we unmute everything, it sounds like this. And again, the mix, I think I've probably screwed it all up by featuring certain instruments as we've been going, but those are all the elements in Underground. So hopefully this is helpful and enjoyable. If you have any questions, let me know. Thank you for watching these. They're fun to do. And, you know, as long as you don't mind the fact that they're pretty off the cuff and production value is what it is. I mean, that's part of what allows me to keep making these. You know, if I can essentially make them for the amount of time it takes to just sort of talk through this, then I am happy to make as many as are helpful that I have time for. So thanks for watching. Any questions, let me know, and I will see you on the next one.